Chapter 3. Kristin avowed with all her heart that Jofrid was a woman who had good use of her hands. If all went well, then Gout had been fortunate. He would have a wife who was as hard-working and diligent as she was rich and beautiful. She herself could scarce have found a more notable woman to step into her shoes at Jorungard, not if she had searched all Norway through. So she said one day, and afterwards she scarce knew how it was that the words had fallen from her lips, that the day Jofrid Helgasdatter became Gaut's wedded wife, she would make over her keys to the young woman and move into the old hall with Lavrans. Afterwards, indeed, she thought it had been well if she had weighed the matter more nicely before she spoke of it. Often already she had been over hasty when she spoke to Jofrid. But one thing was that Jofrid was not well. Kristin had seen it almost as soon as the young girl came to the manor, and Kristin remembered that first winter when she dwelt at Huseby. She was a wedded woman. Her husband and her father were bound together in law, howsoever things might go with their friendship when the wrong done came to light. Yet she had suffered sore remorse and shame, had been bitter against Erland in her heart, and she had been 19 years old. Jofrid was but a bare 17, and here she was now, carried off by force and rightless by law, far from her home among strangers, with Gaut's child under her heart. In her heart, Kristin didn't deny that Jofrid seemed much more strong and stout-hearted than she herself had been. But then Jofrid had not profaned the cloister's holiness, nor broken troth and hand-fasting, nor lied and deceived and stolen her parents' honour behind their backs. Even though these two young folks in their rashness had sinned against the law of the land, against duty and all seemliness, yet so sore a conscience they didn't need to have. Kristin prayed instantly for a good issue to Gaut's deed of madness, and she comforted herself with the thought that it was impossible God's justice could deal out to Gaut and Jofrid a harder lot than had fallen to her and Erland, and they had been wedded. Their child of sin was born to be a lawful partaker in all his kindred's heritage. Since neither Gaut nor Jofrid spoke of the matter, Kristin would not bring it forward, albeit she longed to speak to the unlessoned young girl. Jofrid ought to save her strength now, stay in bed in the morning, and rest instead of being up and about the first of all on the manor. For Kristin saw that the girl had set her heart on being up before her mother-in-law, and doing more than she did. But Jofrid was not one to whom Kristin could offer help or pity. She could but quietly take the heaviest work off her hands, and for the rest treat her, both when alone and in front of the housefolk, as though she were by lawful right the young mistress of the manor. Frida was furious that she must give up her place next to the mistress to Gaut's. She used an ugly word of Jofrid one day she and Kristin were in the kitchen house together. For once Kristin struck her serving woman. "Fair words to come from your mouth, old jade that you are, and mad after men." Frida wiped away the blood from her nose and mouth. "You should be better, great men's daughters like you, and this Jofrid, than Kotar's children. You know that a bride bed with silken sheets awaits you, surely enough. You must be mad after men, and shameless to boot, if you cannot wait. But you must make off to the woods with young blades, and get roadside brats. Fie upon such doings, I say." Be still now. Go out and get washed. You are bleeding down into the bread, said the mistress quietly enough. In the doorway, Frida and Jofrid met. Kristin saw by the young girl's face that she must have heard the words that had been said. The poor wretch chatters like the fool she is. I cannot drive her away. She has nowhere to turn to. Jofrid smiled mockingly, and on that Kristin went on. She fostered 2 of my sons. Gout she did not foster, answered Jofrid. Of that she is never tired of reminding both him and me. Can you not have her wed? She asked sharply. Kristin could not but laugh. Don't you think I have tried? But it never went further when once the man had speech with her. Should she seize the chance, Kristin thought, and speak with Jofrid now? Let her understand that from her she need look for nothing but motherly goodwill. But Jofrid looked so cold and angry. But yet it was plainly to be seen now on Jofrid that she bore another life within her. One day, soon after, she was to clean the feathers for new bolsters. Kristin counselled her to bind something over her hair to keep the down from flying into it. Jofrid tied a linen cloth about her head. It becomes me better now, too, than a bare head, I think, she said, laughing a little. That may well be, said Kristin shortly. She could not understand that as things stood with her, Jofrid would jest about it. Some days after, Kristin came out to the kitchen house and saw Jofrid standing there cleaning some black game. Already blood had spurted up over her arms. In horror, Kristin pulled her aside. Child, you must not touch blood now. Don't you even know that? Oh, do you think then it is true, all things like that women say? Asked Jofrid doubtingly. Then Kristin told of the fire marks that Narkvi had on his breast. She deliberately told the tale so that Jofrid might understand that she was still unmarried when she watched the church burning. You had not thought such things of me, I hope? She asked in a low voice. Oh, yes. Gout told me everything. Your father had promised you to Simon Anderson, but you ran from home with Erland Nicolausson to his mother's sister, and so Lavrans was forced to give consent. That was not how it happened. We did not run away from home. Simon freed me so soon as he knew I loved Erland better, and on that father gave consent. Unwillingly, but he laid my hand in Erland's. I was his hand-fasted maid for a year. Do you think that this was worse? She asked, for Jofrid was grown burning red and looked at the other aghast. The girl scraped some blood and fibre from her white arm with the knife. Aye, she said low, but very firmly. Never had I cast away good name and honour needlessly. I shall tell Gout nothing of this, she said quickly. He believes his father carried you off by force because he could not win you by fair suit. Most like she was right, thought Kristin. As time wore on and Kristin thought and thought upon the matter, it seemed to her it were the most honourable way for Gout to send a word to Helg at Hovland, put his case into his hands, and make suit to be given Jofrid to wife on such terms as Helg thought fit to grant them. But when she spoke of this to Gout, he was not happy and tried to turn the matter aside. At length he asked hotly whether his mother could send a letter over the mountains in winter-time. No, but Sira Dag could doubtless get a letter sent to Ness, and from there along the coast, said his mother. The priest could always have letters sent forward, even in winter-time. Gout said it would be too costly. "Then it will not be your wife that will bear you a child this spring," said his mother angrily. "In no case can the matter be set in order so quickly," said Gout. Kristin saw that he was very angry. An ugly, dark fear took hold on the mother as time went on. She could not but see that Gout's first glowing joy in Jofrid was quite gone. He went about sullen and moody. From the first, this matter of Gout's bride rape could not have looked any worse. But his mother thought it would be far worse if the man should now show that he was afraid of what he had done. If the two young folk repented their sin, it were good and well, but there was an ugly look about it, as though there were here more of unmanly fear of the man he had wronged than of God-fearing penitence. Gout, this one of her sons that she had always trusted the most. It could not be true, as folk had said, that he was untrusty and light with women, that already he was weary of Jofrid, now that his bride was faded and dull, and the time drew near when he must answer to her kinsfolk for his lawless deed. She made excuse for her son. If she could let herself be led astray so easily, she, who had never had anything before her eyes in her girlhood but the virtuous ways of righteous folk. Her sons had known from childhood that their own mother had done wrong, that their father in his youth had had children by another man's wife, and had sinned with a married woman when they were already big boys. Ulf Halderson, their foster father, Frida's loose talk. Oh, it would not be strange if these young men were weak in such things. Wed Jofrid Gout must, if he could win her kinsfolk's consent, and be thankful. But it would be a pity of the maid if she should see now that Gout took her because he had to, against his will. One day in the fast time, Kristin and Jofrid were at work making ready the food wallets for the woodcutters. They beat the dried fish thin and flat, pressed butter into boxes, filled wooden bottles with beer and milk. Kristin saw that it irked Jofrid sorely now to stand thus on her feet the whole time. But Jofrid did but grow angry when Kristin asked her to sit down and rest. To please her a little, it came into Kristin's mind to ask Jofrid of that story of the stallion that folks said Gout had broken in with a maiden's hair ribbon for a bridle. "That was yours, perhaps?" "No," said Jofrid angrily, flushing a deep red. But then her mood changed. "It was Asa's, my sister's," she said, laughing. "It was her Gout courted first. But when I came home, he did not know which one of us he liked the best. But it was Asa he had looked to find at Dahlgren's house last summer when he came down to Son. And he grew angry when I teased him about her. He swore before God and all men that he was not such a one as would be overbold with good men's daughters. There had been nothing more between Asa and him, he said, but that he could sleep in my arms that night without sin. I took him at his word." She laughed again. When she saw Kristin's face, she nodded defiantly. "Yes, it was my will to have Gout for my husband, and trust me, mother, I shall get him. Things fall out most often, so that I do get my will." Kristin woke in pitch darkness. The cold bit her cheeks and nose. When she drew the skins more closely about her, she felt they were rimy with her breath. It must be well on towards morning. But she shivered at the thought of rising to look at the stars. She curled herself up under the furs to keep warm a little longer. Of a sudden, she remembered her dream. She thought she lay in bed down in the little hall at Huseby, and had even now borne a child. It lay in her arms, wrapped in a lambskin, which had slipped and twisted about the little dark red body. Its tiny hands were held clenched over its face. The knees were drawn up against its body and the feet crossed. Now and again it moved a little. It didn't cross her mind to wonder that the boy was not swaddled and that there were no women in the room with them. The warmth of her own body still enwrapped the child as it lay there close to her. Through her arms she still felt it to the very roots of her heart each time the child moved. Weariness and pain lay heavy upon her still, like a darkness that begins to pass away, while she lay looking at her son and feeling joy and love of him grow unceasingly, as the dawn rim brightens along a mountain ridge. The warmth of her own body still enwrapped the child as it lay there close to her. Through her arms she still felt it to the very roots of her heart each time the child moved. Weariness and pain lay heavy upon her still, like a darkness that begins to pass away, while she lay looking at her son and feeling joy and love of him grow unceasingly, as the dawn rim brightens along a mountain ridge. But at the same time as she lay there in the bed, she was standing outside too, by the house wall. Beneath her lay the countryside, shining in the morning sun. It was early morning of a day between winter and spring. She drank in the sharp, fresh air. The wind was icy cold, but in it was a smack of the far-off sea and of melting snow. The ridges right across the dale lay in the morning sun, with snowless patches round the farms, and the crusted snow shone silvery white in all the clearings amid the dark green woods. The sky seemed freshly swept, clear yellow and pale blue, with some few dark, wind-driven cloud wisps swimming above it. But it was cold. Where she stood, the snowdrift was still stone-hard from the night's frost, and between the houses lay cold shadow, for the sun stood just above the eastern ridge behind the manor, and right in front of her, where the shadow ended, the morning wind moved the wan last year's grass. It waved and shone, though steely bright ice clumps still bound its roots. Ah, ah! The moan burst from her breast against her will. Lavrans was still with her. She heard the boy's even breathing from the other bed. And Gout, he lay there in the loft with his lover. The mother sighed again, moved restlessly, and Erland's old dog on the bedspread shifted itself closer against her updrawn legs. Now she heard that Jofrid was afoot in the loft, walking about the floor. Kristin crept out swiftly, thrust her feet into her shaggy fur shoes, and threw on her wadmail dress and fur coat. In the dark she groped her way to the fireplace, squatted down and blew and raked in the ashes. But there kindled not the least spark. The embers had died out in the night. She drew out the flint and steel from her belt pouch, but the tinder must have got wet. It was frozen. At last she gave up the struggle, took the firepan, and went up to borrow live embers from Jofrid. A good fire was burning in the little fireplace of the loft, casting its shine out into the room. In the flickering light, Jofrid sat sewing the copper buckle more firmly upon Gout's reindeer coat. Over in the twilight of the bed, she could make out the man's naked breast and shoulders. Gout slept without a shirt even in the bitterest cold. He was sitting up. He had had something to eat in bed. Jofrid rose, heavy and matronly. Would not mother have a draught of ale? She had warmed up Gout's morning drink, and mother must take this can to Lavrans. He was to go with Gout to the timber felling today. It would be cold for the men. Kristin pursed up her lips in dislike as she stood in her own room again, making up the fire. Jofrid's housewifely busyness, Gout lying there openly having his woman wait on him, the lover's thoughtful care for her unrightful brother-in-law. It all seemed to her so immodest and disgusting. Lavran stayed behind out in the woods, but Gout came home to the evening meal tired and hungry. So the women sat on for a little after the serving folk had gone out to keep the master company while he drank. Kristin saw that Jofrid was not well this evening. Of a sudden the girl let her sewing sink upon her lap, and twinges of pain passed over her face. "Are you in pain, Jofrid?" asked Kristin low. "Oh, yes, a little, in the feet and legs," answered the girl. She had worked all day long, as was her wont, would hear nothing of sparing herself. Now she had got a stitch, and her legs were swollen up. All at once little tears started out from beneath her lashes. Kristin had never seen a woman weep so strangely. She sat there without a sound, her teeth set hard, and round bright tears. To Kristin they looked as hard as pearls, rolled down her marred, brown-flecked face. She seemed angry that she had been forced to give way. Unwillingly she let Kristin help her over to the bed. Gout came after them. "Are you in pain, my Jofrid?" he asked in a chapfallen fashion. He was red as fire in the face from the cold, and he looked on miserably while his mother made Jofrid easy on the bed, drew off her shoes and her hose, and began to tend the swollen feet and legs. "Are you in pain, my Jofrid?" he went on asking. "Yes," said Jofrid in a low voice with smothered rage. "Do you think if I were not, I would be moaning myself like this?" "Are you in pain, my Jofrid?" he began again. "Of course she is. Don't stand there gaping like an oaf, boy." Kristin turned on her son, her eyes flashing. The dull coil in her mind, dread of what might come of it all, impatience at having to suffer the young folks' lawless life here at her manor, gnawing doubts of her son's manhood, burst out in furious wrath. "Are you such a fool that you think she can be well, perhaps? She sees that you are not man enough to dare cross the fells because, forsooth, it is blowing and snowing. You know well that soon she must be down on her knees, this poor little thing, and writhing in the worst of torments, and her child shall be called a bastard because you dare not face her father. You sit warming the bench in the hall, and dare not so much as lift a finger to safeguard the wife you have, and the child that is coming to you. Your father was not so fearful of my father that he dared not go and have speech with him. Nor was he so afraid of the cold that he would not fare on ski over the fells in winter time. Fie upon you, Gout! And woe is me that I must live to call Craven one of the sons Erlen begot with me." Gout took the block chair in both hands, dashed it on the floor, ran to the board, and swept off everything that stood on it. Then he rushed out of the door with a parting kick to the block chair. They heard him run cursing up the loft stairs. "Nay, mother, now you have been over hard with Gout." Jofrid raised up on one elbow. "You cannot look with reason that he should peril his life on the fells in winter, to find my father, and be told whether he has to wed his dishonest bride with the shift he carried me off in for portion, or flee the land an outlaw." The waves of anger still ran high in Kristin's heart. She answered proudly, "Nevertheless, I cannot believe that my son can think so." "No," said Jofrid, "if he did not have me to think for him." When she saw Kristin's face, she went on in a voice that bubbled with laughter. Dear mother, I have had to fight hard enough to hold Gout back. I won't have him doing yet more follies for my sake, and part our children from the wealth I can look to have in heritage from my kinsman. I expect Gout to come to such an accord with them as will be best and most honourable for us all." "What do you mean by this?" asked Kristin. "I mean that if my kinsfolk come in search of Gout, Sir Sigurd will meet them in such a way that they will see Gout does not lack kinsmen to back him. He will have to make full amends, but thereafter it will be for my father to handfast me to Gout, so that I shall again have the right to share with my sisters what he leaves behind." "So you yourself must share the blame?" asked Kristin, "when your child comes into the world and you still unwed?" "Since I could flee from home with Gout, why, no one will believe, I think, that he has laid a drawn sword between us in the bed at night." "Has he never at all made suit for you to your kinsfolk?" asked Kristin. "No. We knew it would be in vain, even had Gout been a much richer man than he is." Jofrid broke into laughter again. "Don't you see, mother? My father thinks he's the shrewdest of all men at a horse bargain. But it would take a man far more wide awake than my father to get the better of Gout Erlendsson in an exchange of horses." Kristin could not forbear smiling, unglad though she was at heart. "I don't know the law so nicely in such matters," she said gravely. "But I think, Jofrid, it will not be easy for Gout to come to such an accord as you will call good. Should Gout be doomed outlaw, and your father take you home with him and let you feel his wrath, or should he require that you go into a cloister and atone for your sins? He cannot send me to a cloister without giving such rich gifts with me that it would be a cheaper bargain and more honourable to make accord with Gout and take amends from him. And don't you see, in that way he can wed me off and doesn't need to lay out anything in goods and gear. And I think, for all the love he bears Olaf, my sister's husband, he would be reluctant that I should not share with my sisters in the heritage. Besides, then my kinsfolk would have this child of mine on their hands too, and I think that father will think twice ere he tries taking me home to Hovland with a bastard child, to make me feel his wrath. He knows me. I don't know so much of the law either, but I know my father, and I know Gout. And now so much time has gone by that this matter can scarce go forward before I am lightened and grown sound again. And then, mother, you shall not see me weep. Oh, no. I am sure Gout will win for us such an accord as— No, mother. Gout, who is come of nobles and kings, and you, who are kin to the best houses in the land, I know you have had to see your sons sunk down from the place they were born to stand in. Yet you shall see your offspring rise in the world again, in Gout's children and mine." Kristin sat silent. It was likely indeed that things might go as Jofrid wished. She saw that she had had no need to grieve so much for the girl. She had grown thin of face now, her cheek's soft rounding was quite worn away, and all the more clearly could it be seen how large and strong was her lower jaw. Jofrid yawned, dragged herself into a sitting posture, and looked around for her footgear. Kristin helped her to draw them on. Jofrid thanked her. "And don't get angry at Gout any more, mother. He doesn't take it lightly that we cannot be wed before, but I will not have my child made poor before it is even born." 14 days later, Jofrid bore a son, a great and comely boy. Gaut sent word to Sundbu that same day, and Sir Sigurd came at once to Jorungard and held Erlend Gautason at his christening. But glad as was Kristin Lavransdatter of her grandson, it vexed her none the less that Erlend's name should be renewed for the first time in a base-born child. "Your father dared more to win his son his rights," she said to Gaut one evening as he sat down in the weaving house watching her make the boy ready for the night. Jofrid was sleeping sweetly already in the bed by the wall. "He didn't love Sir Old Nicolaus overmuch. Yet he would never have honoured his father so little as to give his name to a son not born in wedlock." "No. Orm was named after his mother's father, wasn't it?" asked Gaut. "Ah, mother. Perhaps you will think this is no seemly speech of a son, but I think you can understand that all we brothers saw well, when our father was alive, that you did not think he could be a pattern for us in all things, but now you speak of him late and early as if he had been a holy saint almost. You know well we knew he was not that. We would be proud if any day we would grow to our father's stature, even to his shoulder. We remember always that he was a chieftain, and a man outdoing all other men in such gifts as adorn a man. But you cannot make us believe that he was the meekest and most virtuous of swains in a lady's bower, or the best of husbandmen. Yet no one need wish any better for you, my Erlend, than that you may grow to be like him." He took up the child, who was now swathed up for the night, and thrust his chin down onto the little red face in the bright woolen swaddling cloth. "This well-gifted and hopeful youth, Erlend Gautason of Jorungard. You must tell your grandmother you are not afraid your father will fail you." He made the sign of the cross over the child and laid it back in Kristin's lap, went over to the bed and gazed on the slumbering young mother. "'Tis as well with my Jofrid as can be, do you say?" "She looks pale, but I think you understand such things best. God's peace and sound sleep to all in this house." A month after the boy's birth, Gaut held a great christening ale, and to it his kinsmen gathered from far and near. Kristin guessed that Gaut had asked them to come to take counsel with them in this pass. It was spring now, and he might soon look to hear news of Jofrid's kin. Kristin had the joy of seeing Ivar and Skule at home together. And hither came too her cousins, Sigurd Koning, who was wed with her father's brother's daughter from Skog, Ivar Giesling of Ringheim, and Havard Tronson. She had not seen the Tronsons since Erlend had drawn the men of Sundbu along with him into mischance. They were of middle age now. They had always been careless and light-headed, but high-minded and gallant, and they had changed little. They met both the Erlendsons and their cousin Sir Sigurd, who stood in their shoes at Sundbu, with the free and open bearing befitting kinsmen. Ale and mead now ran in rivers in honour of little Erlend. Gaut and Jofrid gave their guests as free and unabashed a welcome as if they had been lawfully wedded, and the king himself had made their marriage. All was mirth, and no one seemed to call to mind that the two young folks' honour and welfare was still at hazard. But Kristin learned that Jofrid had not forgotten it. "The more freely and boldly they meet my father, the easiest will he give way," she said. "And Olaf Piper could never hide that he loves full well to sit on the same bench with men of the old houses." The only person that did not seem completely happy in this gathering of kinsmen was Sir Gemelt Halvardsson. King Magnus had dubbed him knight this last Yule. Ramborg Lavransdatter now bore the name of lady. This time Sir Hjemelt had his eldest stepson, Andres Simonsson, with him. Kristin had begged this of him when last Hjemelt was north, for she had heard a waif word that the boy was strange. A great dread had fallen on her. Could it be that he had taken hurt in soul and body from those dealings of hers with him when he was a child? But his stepfather said no. The boy was sound and strong, good as gold, and maybe his wits were better than most folks. It was but that he saw visions. He would seem rapt at times, and afterwards would often do the strangest things, even as it was last year. He had taken his silver spoon one day. It was the very one he had from Kristin as a birth gift, and a shirt pin that his father had left him, and then he went forth from the manor and down to a bridge that is over the river on the highway near Ailinn. There he sat for many hours. At last there came over the bridge 3 beggars, an old man and a young woman with a suckling child. Andres goes up to them, gives them the trinkets, and begs leave to bear the child for the woman. At home they were beside themselves with fear when Andres did not come to the midday meal, nor yet to supper. They went out and searched the countryside, and at length Hjemelt got word that Andres had been seen far north in the neighbouring parish, in company with some folk called Crep and Cracker. He was carrying their little one. When next day Hjemelt got hold of the boy at last, he said, after much asking, that he had heard a voice the last Sunday during Mass, while he stood looking at the picture painted on the panel before the altar. It was God's mother and St. Joseph journeying with the child to the land of Egypt, and he had wished he had lived in those days, for then he would have prayed that he might have leave to go with them and bear the child for Mary Virgin. Then had he heard a voice, the gentlest and sweetest in all the world, and it promised to show him a sign if he would go to the Björkheim bridge on a certain day. Otherwise Andres was reluctant to speak of his visions, for the parish priest said they were likely part feigning and part brain-sick wanderings, and he frightened his mother well nigh from her wits with his strange ways. But he talked much with an old serving-maid, a rarely pious woman, and with a preaching brother who was wont to wander through the parish at Lent and Advent. It was like enough the boy would choose the spiritual life, and so, maybe, it would be Simon Simonsson, who, in time to come, would settle down as master at Formo. He was a healthy and a lively child, most like to his father, and Ramborg's darling. Ramborg and Hjemelt had as yet had no children together. Kristin had heard from folk who had seen her at Raumarik that Ramborg was grown passing fat and sluggish. She went visiting among the richest and mightiest folk in the Southland, but north to her home country she would never come. And Kristin had not seen her only sister since that day of their parting at Formo. But Kristin thought she could see that Ramborg still nursed the old grudge against her. She lived happily with Hjemelt, and he cared for his stepchildren's welfare with love and forethought. He had taken order that the eldest son of the man who would be his chief heir if he died childless should wed Ulfhild Simonsdatter. Thus, at the worst, Simon Dar's daughter would have the good of his estates after him. Unjerd had been wedded with Grund of Eiken the year after her father's death. Gert Dar and Hjemelt had made her as rich a portion as they knew Simon meant to give this child of his, and she was happy, Hjemelt said. Grund let himself be guided in all things by his wife, and they had 3 fair children already. Kristin was strangely moved when she saw Simon and Ramborg's eldest son once more. He was Lavrans Bjorgulfsson's living likeness, much more so even than Gout. And in these last years Kristin had had to give up her belief that Gout was so like her father in his frame of mind. Andres Dar was now in his 12th year, tall and slender, fair-haired and comely, and somewhat quiet in bearing. Though he seemed healthy and happy of mood, had good strength of body, and a good stomach to his food, save that he would eat no flesh. There was something in him that marked him out from other boys, but Kristin could not say what it was, though she watched him closely. Andras was soon good friends with his mother's sister, but he never said anything of his visions, and did not fall into any raptures while he was in Sill. The four Erlandsons seemed to take pleasure in being together in their mother's manor, but Kristin got but little speech with her sons. When they talked among themselves, she felt that their lives and their concerns were slipping now beyond her range of sight. The two who had come from outside had left their home already, and the two who dwelt on the manor would soon for sure be taking its governance out of her hands. The meeting fell in the middle of the spring dearth, and she saw now that Gout must have made ready for it by saving fodder in winter more than was common, and he had borrowed fodder from Sir Sigurd too. But all this he had ordered without taking counsel with her. And all the parleyings about Gout's affair went on, as it were, over her head, even though she sat in the room with the men. So it was little surprise to her when one day Ivar came and said that Lavrans would keep him company when he went back to Ronheim. Howbeit, one day Ivar Erlandsson said to his mother that he thought it were well she should come and live with him at Ronheim when once Gout was wedded. Signy were a more towardly daughter-in-law to live with in the house, I think, and I'm sure it cannot be easy for you to give up the reins here, where you have been wont to rule. For the rest, it was plain he liked Jofrid, he and all the other men. Only Sir Gemelt seemed to look upon her somewhat coolly. Kristin sat with her little grandson in her lap, and thought it would scarce be easy for her either at the one or the other place. It was a hard matter growing old. It did not seem so long ago that it was she herself who was the young woman. Then it was about her fate that the men's strife and counsels tossed. Now she had drifted into a backwater, and not long ago her own sons had been even as this one here on her lap. She thought of the dream of the newborn babe. At this time the thought of her own mother rose often in her mind, her mother that she could not remember as anything else other than an ageing, heavy-hearted woman. Yet she had been young, she too, when she lay and warmed her baby girl with her body's warmth. Her mother too had been marked in youth, body and soul, by the bearing and nourishing of children. And she had thought perhaps no more than Kristin herself when she sat with that sweet young life at her breast, that so long as they two lived, each single day would lead the child farther and farther from her arms. "When you had borne yourself a child, Kristin, I thought you would understand," her mother had said once. Now she understood that her mother's heart had been scored deep with memories of her daughter, memories of thoughts for her child from the time it was unborn, and from all the years a child remembers nothing of, memories of fear and hope and dreams that children never know have been dreamed for them, until their own time comes to fear and hope and dream in secret. At length the gathering of kinsmen broke up, so far as that some took up their abode with Gemelt at Formo, and some went with Sigurd over to Vargar. But at last one day 2 of Gout's tenants from south in the dale came galloping into the manor with tidings. The warden was on his way north to seek out Gout at his home, and the maid's father and kinsmen were in his train. Young Lavrans ran straight away to the stable. Next evening it looked as though an army was gathered at Jorengard. All Gout's kinsmen were there with their armed followers, and his friends in the parish had come to the meeting too. Then came Helg of Hovland with a great following to crave his right against the ravisher. Kristin caught a glimpse of Helg Duke as he rode into the courtyard alongside of Sir Paul Sorkvason, the warden himself. Jofrid's father was an oldish, tall and bent-backed man of sickly look. When he lighted from his horse, it was seen one leg was shorter than the other. The sister's husband, Olaf Piper, was short, broad and thick-set, with red skin and hair. Gout went forward to meet them. He bore himself gallantly, with head held high, and behind him he had the whole array of kinsmen and friends. They stood in a half-circle before the upper hall steps. In the midst, the two elder men of knightly rank, Sir Sigurd and Sir Gemelt. Kristin and Jofrid watched the meeting from the shed of the weaving house, but they could not hear the words that were said. The men went up into the loft, and the two women turned into the weaving house. They could not speak. Kristin sat by the hearth-place. Jofrid walked the floor, bearing her child in her arms. Some time went by thus. Then Jofrid wrapped a coverlid about the boy and went out with him. An hour later, Gemelt Halvardsson came in to his sister-in-law as she sat there alone, and told her the outcome. Gout had proffered to Helge Duke 16 marks in gold in amends for Jofrid's honour and for carrying her off by the strong hand. It was the same as Helge's brother had got for his son's life, and he stood ready to espouse Jofrid at her father's hands, making her a fitting mourning gift, an extra gift. But on his part Helge should accord him and his daughter his full forgiveness, so that she should have a like portion with her sisters and share with them in the heritage. Sir Sigurd, on behalf of Gout's kin, stood surety that he would keep his bond. Helge Duke seemed willing to fall in with the proffer straight away, but his son-in-law, Olaf Piper, and Nereid Karason, who was Asa's betrothed, spoke against it, and said that Gout must be the most brazen of all men, to presume to fix terms himself for his wedding with a maid he had dishonoured, while he was in her brother-in-law's manor, and thereafter borne away by force, or to crave that she should share in her sister's heritage. It was easy to see, said Gemelt, that Gout himself did not like this haggling over the price he should pay for wedding a well-born maid, whom he had led astray, and who had now borne him a son. But it was easy to see, too, he had been made to learn both the lessons and the sermon by heart, so that he did not have to read them from a book. While they were still in the middle of the parleyings, and friends on both sides were seeking to bring them to accord, Jofrid came in with the child in her arms. At that her father broke down and could not keep back his tears. So it was settled as she had wished. That Gout could never have paid such amends was clear, but Jofrid's portion was so fixed that the one quit the other. Thus, in very deed, the outcome of the bargain was that Gout took Jofrid, and got little more with her than what she had in her wallets when she came to the manor, while for her extra gift and mourning gift he gave her by deed the most of what he owned, with his brother's consent. But some day great riches would come to him through Jofrid, if indeed the marriage were not childless, said Ivar Jesling, laughing. All the men joined in the laugh, but Kristin flushed red, for Gemelt sat listening to all the gross jests that now flew about. The next day Gout Erlendsson handfasted Jofrid Helgesdatter, and forthwith she held her churching, with as much honour as if she had been a wife. Sira Dag said she had a right to this now. Then she journeyed with the child to Sundbu, and lived in Sir Sigurd's ward until the wedding. That day month, just after John's Mass, the bridal was held. It was a brave and a stately one. The morning after, with great solemnity, Kristin Lavransdatter made over her keys to her son, and Gout fastened the bunch to his wife's girdle. Thereafter Sir Sigurd Eldjarn gave a great banquet at Sundbu, and while there he and his cousins, the former owners of Sundbu, solemnly swore friendship and confirmed the oath with their hands and seals. With a bounteous hand Sir Sigurd made gifts from the treasures that were at his manor, both to the jestlings and to all the guests according to the nearness of their kinship and friendship, drinking horns, table plate, trinkets, weapons, fur robes and horses. And thus all folk thought that Gout Erlandson had brought this matter of his bride theft to a most honourable issue.